welcome to the PlantEurope panel discussion titled The Path to Sustainable Protein. I'm very pleased to be here with you today. A quick introduction to myself while we're waiting for a few people to join. My name is Dr. Shireen Kassam, and I will be facilitating this panel discussion. I'm a medical doctor and have been working in the National Health Service in the UK for the last 23 years. I'm also passionate about the role of plant-based diets in clinical practice for both personal and planetary health. I provide education and advocacy on plant-based diets through my non-profit organisation, Plant-Based Health Professionals UK, and through my work at the University of Winchester, where I run an accredited course on plant-based nutrition for healthcare professionals. I've been working with my hospital to change the food environment to one that is more plant-based and sustainable, so I'm really excited to be here with our speakers today to find out what the path to sustainable protein might look like. I look forward to spending the next 2 hours with you. Before we start, a few words about the PlantEurope project itself. The PlantEurope network connects pioneers from the field of plant-based nutrition across Europe to support and accelerate the transformation of the food system. The PlantEurope network provides a website with helpful information, studies and tools. A community has also been created so that users can connect directly with each other. In addition, 2 reports will be produced during the project. One on political strategies and instruments on how to promote plant-based food in Europe, and the other on good practices and diverse approaches in European countries. The PlantEurope team is also conducting a total of 3 online panel discussions on different topics within the framework of the project. Today's panel discussion is the last of the 3. The recordings of the prior discussions can be found on our YouTube channel. Our panel discussion today is centered around the dynamic landscape of plant-based and cultivated protein. In a time where the imperatives of sustainability and environmental consciousness take center stage, our conversation will introduce the pioneering solutions and initiatives that are reshaping the trajectory of protein production. We have brought together a diverse group of experts, innovators, and research leaders to further the exchange of knowledge, experiences, and visionary perspectives. Whether you're deeply rooted in the food industry, passionate about environmental sustainability, or merely curious about emerging practices, this event aims to deliver not only valuable insights, but also foster meaningful discussions that contribute to a more sustainable and plant-based future. So thank you for joining us today for a discussion on the path to sustainable protein production and its pivotal role in our collective journey towards a greener, more sustainable world. Joining me today are Dr. Marco Springmann, Professor in Climate Change, Food Systems and Health at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and Bordier, Director of Food Initiatives at the World Resources Institute, Julia Martin, Cellular Agriculture Project Lead at ProVeg International, María Cermeño, co-founder and CSO of the Spanish startup Poseidona, and David Hunt, Research Support Manager at the Good Food Institute. So without further ado, I'm very excited to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Marco Springmann. He was part of the Eat Lancet Commission on Food, Planet, Health and contributed to their seminal report on the planetary health diet. He'll be mentioning the findings of the Commission and explaining why plant-based proteins offer a chance to switch from a food system that's reliant on animal agriculture to one that's more sustainable, and not only for us as humans, but also for the planet. And he'll be talking about how to support consumer change in behaviours. So over to you, Marco.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Shireen, for the kind introduction, and hello, everybody online. Let me share my screen to kick you off. I hope you can see the slides now. Scream if you can't. I thought I'd give a little overview of sort of the state of play of the global food system. At the moment, we know that dietary risks are a leading risk factor for non-communicable diseases and premature mortality around the world. Up to 1 in 4 people die because they not only have the wrong dietary or they have dietary imbalances when it comes to composition, but also to over or under eating in the world. This has tremendously high costs, not only to people personally in terms of healthcare costs, but also to countries' healthcare budgets, projected to be over 1 trillion in 2030. And on the other side, we also know the food system is also tremendously unsustainable. So at the moment already, it's a major driver of climate change, with 1/3 of all greenhouse gas emissions due to the food system or the production of foods in the food system. It's also a major driver of land use change and biodiversity loss, with 40% of the Earth's land surface used for agriculture. It's a major contributor to freshwater depletion, with about 70% of freshwater withdrawals attributable to the food system. And lastly, it's a major polluter of terrestrial and aquatic systems through fertilizer runoff, with already over 400 dead zones in oceans where that are oxygen depleted. We estimated that if we don't change course, we run the risk of exceeding basically all kinds of planetary boundaries or environmental limits that guarantee a safe operating space for humanity. And those include climate change, land use change and biodiversity loss, blue water or freshwater use, and biogeochemical flows related to phosphorus and nitrogen application. We also found that we could, if we implemented all kinds of food system measures, we could collectively stay within those planetary boundaries. And those include changes to at least flexitarian diets. That is the green bar here, called FLX, but also improvements in farm level management and technology, called Tech and Tech Plus here. And there were smaller contributions due to reductions in food loss and waste. That's the W divided by 2, as well as better socioeconomic development, called SSP1 here. Why do we see those different distributions across those environmental domains? Well, the answer for this is very much in the environmental footprints. For greenhouse gas emissions, we know that the difference between the highest emitting animal source food and the lowest emitting plant-based food is about a factor of 100, so very high. Whereas for the other environmental domains like land use, water use, and nitrogen and phosphorus application, the difference is more a factor of 10. And because we eat much more grains, we see basically this differentiation between livestock-dominated and stable-dominated crops, with livestock or any animal source food having an outsized impact on greenhouse gas emissions and climate change, whereas they still do have a contributing factor on the other environmental domains, but there still grains make up for lots of the impacts. The tech changes that have very high contributions to staying collectively within the environmental limits for land use, water use, and nitrogen and phosphorus application, those are not tech changes that are necessary to be had in high-income countries like many of the ones that we are sitting in right now. That is very much a story of unequal distribution of resources. So this map here shows you yield gaps that tell you how much food you can get out of a given piece of land, given appropriate application of inputs. Like water, fertilizer, and so on. And you see, for example, in the continent of Africa, much more food could be produced if they had access to those resources. Whereas in high-income countries, we are very much already at very high production. So the improvements in tech would have much less of an impact. Well, how do those dietary changes though look like, that without which we wouldn't be able to stay within the planetary boundary of climate change? Well, one potential version of this would be the planetary health diet that we developed within the Eat Lancet Commission. According to those fairly general recommendations, one shouldn't have more than 1 serving of red meat per week, and red meat includes pork, beef, and lamb. Not more than 2 servings of poultry per week, not more than 2 servings of fish per week, and not more than 1 serving of dairy per day. And then plenty of fruits and vegetables, 5 to 6 portions, 1 to 2 per day, 1 to 2 portions of legumes per day, 1 to 2 portions of nuts per day, and whole grains instead of refined grains. Of course, you can always be more plant-based as well, and that is totally fine and even somewhat more sustainable and more healthy. But we calculated that collectively, if we also combine that with other changes in the food system, this kind of dietary pattern would allow us to collectively stay within planetary boundaries. How do those dietary changes look like? Well, if you parse it out over the week, it actually doesn't sound super crazy. It's only 2 days a week that you should try to be vegetarian or vegan. However, even this sort of what for some of us might feel like fairly reasonable, well-balanced dietary pattern would be a huge departure from what is eaten at the moment. So globally, it would be a reduction of over 80% in red meat consumption and 90% in high-income countries, and still 50% actually even in low-income countries. That even though people always think meat consumption is much lower there, and that is true, but it's also already above that 1 portion of red meat per week. And otherwise, very high increases in fruits, vegetables, legumes, pretty much around the world, and proportionally more so in low-income countries where diets are somewhat more dominated by stable grains. How can we help consumers eat better and healthier? Well, the first starting point is obviously dietary guidelines. So we did a study where we reviewed all dietary guidelines and looked, are they actually in line with what we think is healthy and sustainable? And the unfortunate answer was like basically hardly any dietary guideline met global health and sustainability targets. What are those targets? Well, we tried to basically map the planetary boundaries to targets that the international community has agreed on, like the Sustainable Development Goals or the Paris Climate Agreement or the WHO's NCD agenda. And there is really very much a one-to-one relationship between planetary boundaries and those targets. And as you can see here, we found basically no dietary guideline met all these targets. And the reason for that was very often, and you can see here that it's most often basically the climate target that wasn't achieved, that the recommendations for moderating the consumption of animal source foods was way too lax and very often lacking or unclear. So this is something that really would need to be improved to make dietary advice fit for purpose. At the same time, we also found that because most dietary guidelines are not really detailed enough when it comes to providing clear advice on different food groups, they could also be up to a third healthier if you compare them to, for example, the Eat Lancet dietary patterns. Lastly, you might, of course, say, well, hardly anybody eats according to dietary guidelines anyway, and that's indeed also what we found in that study. So we calculated what kind of investment would actually be worthwhile to support dietary changes towards healthy and sustainable diets. And just if you value basically the health improvements that you could have from better diets, you could see that you could spend in excess of 15% of GDP on health promotion programs that would help to shift the needle, and that would still pass a fairly standard cost-benefit test that in very many OECD countries, for example, are required for major policy initiatives. Well, what are some of those other policies that we can think about? We know that just providing information, like with dietary guidelines, doesn't really shift the needle much, and one needs to have much more of a package, basically, of policies, including, for example, fiscal measures like taxation, subsidies, or other economic incentives. On that, we have done a couple of studies. For example, we looked at what would happen if you priced in the cost of climate climate damages into the price of foods, and we found that that could contribute to shifting diets to ones that are both healthier and more sustainable. And indeed, in all countries, we identified a different a tax scheme that would result in those co-benefits. Then you could also come from the other perspective, since, for example, red and processed meat have been declared as carcinogenic and likely carcinogenic to humans. So that opens up the rationale for regulating them. So you could, for example, price in a cost of treating diseases related with red and processed meat. And also here we found that, for example, in high-income countries, unprocessed meat would need to be 30% more expensive and processed meat double in price in order to recoup basically those treatment costs. And also those would be associated with both health and environmental co-benefits. Lastly, of course, not all policies have to be at the consumption side. We also need to think about how should we reorient production to be in line with producing diets that are both healthy and sustainable. And instead of ever more producing staple crops, sugars, and animal source foods, we really need less of those and more of fruits, vegetables, legumes, and nuts and seeds, as you can see here. So one important thing for that is to realign agricultural subsidies. And here we calculated where what subsidies are currently used for. And you can see that only a fraction of those are currently used for healthy and sustainable food commodities like horticultural products. So we ran through a simulation exercise to see what could happen if we reoriented those agricultural subsidies. And indeed, we found that if we couple, for example, half of all subsidies to the production of healthy and sustainable foods, that then would not only result in health and environmental benefits, but it would also be economically prudent and not result in a detrimental economic impact. And especially so if we couple that with a global reform of agricultural subsidies. I stop here. Here are the references if you want to read more on these. For most of the studies, we produce country-level estimates. So if you're in a specific country, please look them up. We also recently released an interactive modeling tool called the Diet Impact Assessment Model that is on the WHO Europe website and was co-funded by them. So if you want to play around a little bit with assessing impacts of different diets and dietary changes, please check that out as well. And if you have any comments, questions, or whatever you can think about, please do contact me either at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine or at Oxford. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Marco. As expected, that was a wonderful overview of the current problem with the food systems and where we need to get to align with both health and sustainability goals. So our second presentation or speaker will be Anne Bordier. She is currently working for the World Resources Institute. Her organisation focuses on meeting people's essential needs, food being one of the most essential. Her work at WRI includes leading a team of researchers, communication and engagement experts who work with a wide range of food providers and food sector stakeholders to embed a target, measure, act approach to reduce food loss and waste and to shift diets towards lower carbon and healthier foods. Thanks very much, Anne.
Thank you very much, and I'm really delighted to be with you today. So just waiting for the slides to come up. Thank you. So today I would like to build on what Marco just said and share with you a couple of thoughts on why we are prioritizing shifting diets as a key action to address the climate and nature crisis, what practical actions food providers we are working with are taking or can take to shift diets, and I will share with you some learnings from our initiative, Cool Food. And then finally, I also wanted to share some thoughts on where alternative protein can play a role in this transition. Next slide, please. So starting with the why, and Marco has talked to that already, but as we all know, food and agriculture accounts for 1/3 of global emissions. And of course, that's the third largest sector after energy and transport, so it's extremely significant. And livestock farming, especially beef and lamb, takes the lion's share of those emissions and are key contributors to deforestation. So that's why one of the indicators that we track at WRI is daily per capita ruminant meat consumption. And we've calculated that we shouldn't consume more than 60 calories each day. And that's basically the same as eating 1.5 burgers per week. So you can see on this chart that although consumption has reduced, and this chart looks at high consumption regions, the decrease is not going down fast enough. In fact, it needs to go down 8 times faster. So we have a lot of work to do. Next slide, please. We believe we essentially have 3 levers to shift diets, and they are both demand side and supply side levers. And of course, they are interconnected. So the first one is we really need to shift diets towards diets richer in plants, especially in countries where meat consumption is very high. And that is really what the Cool Food Initiative is designed to do. The second lever is to improve agricultural practices to reduce the impact of the meat we continue to produce, because clearly some people will want to continue to eat meat. And then the third lever is alternative proteins, because it would be really, really helpful if we could offer a lower emission substitute for meat eaters. And we believe that alternative proteins could be to meet what electric vehicles or renewables are in other sectors. But what we really believe is that we have such a long way to go. We have to pull all 3 levers at the same time. So it's not an either or, it's an all of the above strategy. Next slide, please. So at WRI, our focus so far has very much been on the demand side. So that's really about shifting towards diets which are richer in plants. And that's why we launched the Cool Food Initiative 4 years ago. So Cool Food is designed to leverage the reach of the food service sector to create behavior change at scale and make it possible for millions of people to enjoy lower carbon and healthier meals every day. Through Cool Food, we now work with about 80 organizations who together serve 8 billion meals a year. And they work in lots of different sectors and different communities. So we've got restaurants, corporate canteens, universities, schools, healthcare facilities, which are all part of the initiative. And what we do is we help them set a target to reduce the climate impact of the food they serve, measure and track progress, and then take action by implementing behavior change interventions to shift demand in their facilities. And we believe that's quite a unique approach because it combines environmental knowledge with behavior science expertise and marketing techniques. And the good news is that it works. The early adopters of our Cool Food Pledge have been able to reduce their emissions per plate by 10% since they joined the program. Next slide, please. We're really pleased to see that some sectors are forging ahead. This year, for the first time, we were able to analyze the progress of our cohort by key sector. And what I've put on the slide here for you is the collective progress of the 23 healthcare facilities in our cohort, which together have successfully delivered a 21% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions per plate, which puts them well on track to achieve their 2030 reduction goal. And you can see that's been achieved through a reduction in the animal-based food they serve on the average plate, and a corresponding increase in fruit and veg, which now account for half of the volume of food purchased. And what a key message here is that small changes can have a really big impact. And we are seeing other sectors in our cohort, like cities and universities, delivering similar results. So we're now on a mission to scale this early success of the Target, Measure, Act approach and accelerate progress. But what have we learned? Next slide, please. The first thing is that food providers really need to understand their food-related emissions. And we know this can be challenging for some organizations, but it's really vital that they make a start. because as we all know, what gets measured gets done. What we found through Cool Foods, though, is that it's okay for organizations to start with imperfect data and build from there, as long as the methodologies they use is robust and underpinned by recognized standards. Next slide, please. The second learning is that, for people to shift their diets, we need to make sure we give them good food. And of course, taste is really important. So we need to make sure that food providers continue to delight their guests as they re-engineer their food offer. And I think this point is particularly critical when we talk about alternative proteins, because one of the criticisms of those products is that they don't always taste great. And I will come back to that a little later. So what we've learned by working on Cool Food is that there are a lot of proven behavior change techniques that food service companies can implement to encourage their guests to choose climate-friendly food. And let me be clear, behavior change is not just about relying on consumers to make better choices. What we are talking about here is food providers being very intentional in introducing interventions which are scientifically proven to shift demand, often unconsciously. So that could be the dish itself, or how it's called, or how it's displayed on the counter. We call this our 6P behavior change framework, which you have on the slide. And you can look at our playbook, which is on our website, which details all those interventions. And actually, we have the next edition coming out next year, so do look out for that. Next slide, please. Let me finish with a few remarks on the role alternative proteins can play as we seek to shift diets. As I said at the beginning, we have such a long way to go that we need to work both on demand side levers and supply side. It's not an either or. We really need all the strategies at our disposal. So there's no doubt that alternative proteins have a critical role to play in this transition that we need to make. And actually, they could be a real game changer. They could be to meet what electric vehicles are to the car industry. The question is, though, what do we need to do to scale those products in a way that delivers for climate, people, and nature? And I think the first difficulty here is that there are a lot of views on this, and those views tend to be very polarized, as I put on the few examples on the slide here. So I think what is really important here is that we build a really solid evidence base to build confidence of investors on one side and consumers on the other, and also to inform government policies and market incentives, which are going to enable to scale this new product category in a way that minimizes any negative impacts. I think it's really important that to make alternative protein products successful, we focus our efforts in the right areas. One of the challenges with early alternative protein products, and I think it's still the case in many instances, is that they didn't always taste great. They are often quite expensive, and they are often marketed at vegetarians and vegans. And we know from our behavior change research, actually, that's the best way to turn meat eaters off. So I think it's important that to be effective, meat alternatives need to taste like meat. They need to be price competitive. They need to be similar or better nutritiously than the products they are trying to replace. And they need to be marketed in a way that appeals to flexitarians and meat eaters. The food industry is actually very good at manufacturing and marketing new products. So it should be possible to do this, but we're going to need the right, research and investment, incentives, marketing strategies to create the kind of products that will actually create the outcomes we are looking for. And we're going to need wider government policies to stimulate demand and also obviously support the wider livestock sector through this transition. So there's quite a lot of work to do. Final slide, please. So in summary, I would like to leave you with 3 takeaways. The first one is there is real urgency in accelerating dietary shifts, especially in high consumption countries. The second point is that change is possible. And through our initiative, Cool Food, we've shown that small changes can really have a big impact. And there are very practical strategies that food providers can follow to measure progress and also make it possible for people to make better choices. And finally, I think alternative proteins can be part of the solution, but we need to answer some of the unresolved questions that are still out there and create the conditions for these products to scale in the right way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and that talk really resonated with me as I've been trying to work on the National Health Service hospitals and their shift away from animal source protein, and it's an uphill battle. I might connect with you afterwards. I'd love my hospital to sign up to the Cool Food Pledge, but not happened yet. So thank you. So moving on to our next speaker, it's a great pleasure to introduce María Cermeño from Spain. We're going to be shifting in gear away from the changes that we need to make to how we're going to deliver the alternate protein production. And María is co-founder of Poseidona, a startup researching and producing sustainable proteins from algal waste and invasive biomass. So thank you very much, María.
Thank you very much. I think you can see my screen.
Yes.
So thank you very much for the introduction, Shireen. Yeah, my name is María Cermeño. I'm the Chief Scientific Officer and co-founder of the startup Poseidona. So I'm gonna give you a brief introduction on what it means to be an alternative protein startup company. Poseidona was born because obviously we all know that there is an environmental problem, and part of that problem is us, it's people. So we are a lot of people in this world, and we all need to be fed. We all need minimum requirements of protein. And so far, we've been doing okay with animal protein and vegetable protein, right? There is a few reports that are estimating that in 2020, an average person will consume like 11.5 kilograms of animal protein per year. And we all know that in 2050, we're going to be approximately 9.8 billion people in this world, which means to increase the number of animals and increase the number of or the amount of animal protein that we're going to consume to feed us all. So this, as Marco and Anne have said already, it's obviously unsustainable. It's not a good system, right, for production. Due to greenhouse emissions, the animal welfare as well, and also a series of reasons. That's why we have been moving slightly to actually a plant-based diet or a plant-based protein, and it's being developed quite a lot in the last few years. However, there is a problem with this. Now it's easy to just go to a restaurant or to go to the store and actually get a plant-based burger if you want, right? But when you look at the second ingredient of this plant-based burger, it will probably be one of these ingredients, either soybean and pea protein. Why? Because these two ingredients are cheap, are available, are easy, are functionality, it's very good, very comparable with animal protein, and they are simple, they are easy for the food industry. So they constantly use these two ingredients, which it's well known at this point that they are a problem to the solution that we want to solve, because their cultivation is increased. It's estimated to increase up to 80% in 2050. This is already leading to deforestation and monocultivation of these crops. And again, it loses the possibility of other plant proteins to actually come into the market, because it makes them very, very expensive. That's why we actually want to attack to this problem. And in Poseidona, we do is like we look, think outside the box or think outside the land, and we look into the ocean. So we believe that seaweed protein is the new sustainable soy. For this, we actually get our protein from different seaweed side streams and seaweed, invasive seaweeds. How do we do this? Very simple. Here on the left, upper left, you can see seaweed that has been treated to extract the agar. So basically all the agar-agar that we consume and that we use in microbiology, it's obtained from seaweed, and they do extract the agar, and then the residue goes for feed or for landfilling, and it has still a 30% protein. So we can reuse these and extract that protein in order to obtain or to give value, an extra value to that seaweed. On the other hand, another line of our research is the invasive seaweed. So especially in the Mediterranean coast, there is a couple of species that are causing a lot of damage in the sea at the moment, both to seaweed, to sea plants, to animals even, to fishermen. And these invasive seaweed have between 10 and 20% protein that can, again, be reused, be extracted and be reused for new ingredients. So what we do with these two is to apply a proprietary technology that we're going to apply for a patent in the next month. And we obtain something like this in powder. In this case, it's in liquid form, but we obtain a powder that is a protein concentrate and a protein hydrolysate that then we can use for integrating or for creating new products. For example, this is a tuna steak made out of plant protein. So our business will be business to business, where we have the ingredients and we give it to a company that wants to produce these products. So why seaweed protein? Simple. For us, it's low cost because we don't need to cultivate the seaweed, and we are actually reusing something that is having used already. So the cost it's like very low, and we only have to invest in the technology to obtain this protein, same as soy, for example. It is sustainable because, again, we are contributing to circular economy and to blue economy. And we target for at least 4 of the Sustainable Development Goals. We all know that seaweed is highly nutritional and functional. We just need to give a quick look to scientific research, and there is loads and loads and loads of reports that explain how good these proteins are. Then they are scalable as well. If you compare, for example, with microalgae, it's still in development, whereas seaweed, it's everywhere. Like there's tons and tons of seaweed. And also it has low allergenicity and non-GMO compared to, for example, soy protein. Now, on the other side, it's not that easy. It's obviously there is challenges associated to seaweed, otherwise everyone will be using it. Some of them is the taste and the color of the actual extract. As you can see, it's quite brownish, yellowish, so you cannot use it for any applications. You can only use it for specific ones, for example, meat, plant-based meat or plant-based fish alternatives. You wouldn't put it in a shrimp, for example. Also, the marine taste, it won't go well, for example, for yogurt products. So there is a full development here on how to become a neutral seaweed protein powder. Then the low protein yields, this compared to soy, obviously it's a negative point because soy you can get quite high, and you can get quite high protein yields. However, with seaweed, we are now trying to, it's one of our objectives, try to improve this as much as possible. And also regulation. Obviously, novel foods is important, especially in invasive seaweed. And then there is also certain steps that one needs for invasive seaweed to avoid the reproduction of the algae or the seaweed around and cause more damage. As I mentioned, we're a startup. We started in early this year, 2023, and we've gone through different programs. So if anyone wants to open up a startup or a small company, we have gone through different programs, especially we are now in ProVeg International that will finish in a couple of weeks. And we are very happy with it because it gives you actually a full overview of all the problems of a startup can have. And with a reduced team, it's very important to have more and more people that can contribute to your company. For example, they gave us a lot of advice on finances, in market strategy, sustainability, regulation, as I mentioned before, is a very good point. And contacts, a lot of networking and finances. It's scalability as well. So it's great as an extra point of view. There is a lot of alumni as well that can help on their own experiences in different startups. And finally, Poseidona will be anything without the team. Here on the left, you have Sonia Hortels, the CEO and co-founder of Poseidona. She has a master's in food science, and she's been previously working in alternative protein, a lot of companies, and she was the co-founder of Current Foods. That was a very good company that was developing plant-based seafood. Myself, I have a PhD in food biochemistry by University of Limerick, Ireland. And I also worked there for like 5 years in extraction of ingredients from the agri-food industry, especially with byproducts, but also with seaweed, with insects, with legumes, etc. And working closely with Kerry Company. And also was 1 year in Switzerland, Werner Fachhochschule, working closely with Nestle as well to develop and investigate different plant proteins. Technofunctional properties of different plant proteins. And finally, Oscar, who is the junior scientist of Poseidona. He has a master's in food innovation and food development by University of Barcelona. He was previously working also in Current Foods, and he's going to pursue a PhD in all the sensory part of the seaweed. That's it. Also, thank to the advisory board and collaborators that obviously they are there when for stuff that one is not very comfortable with. Thank you very much. And we are hiring at the moment, so if there is anybody that could spread the word, thank you very much, and happy to answer questions later on.
Thank you very much, Maria. I mean, that was a new topic to me, and congratulations for what you're doing. And I think you might have a lot of people emailing you wanting to work with you, because you are clearly on the cutting edge of this field of alternate protein. So thank you. So really, obviously, alternate proteins are now sort of hot topic at the moment, and it certainly was for a big topic at this year's New Food Conference held in Berlin just last month. And that was organised by ProVeg International. So it's a great pleasure to have a speaker from ProVeg International joining us next. It's Julia Martin, who leads their cellular agriculture project and has extensive knowledge and expertise in the field of cellular agriculture. And so she's going to be introducing this interesting topic and the method of producing proteins. So over to you.
So, well, thank you, Shireen, and thank you, everybody, for being here with me today. As introduced, my name is Julia Martin. I am the Cellular Agriculture Project Lead at ProVeg International, and today I will be telling you more about cultivated meat, which is a promising alternative protein to feed the future. So first of all, I guess, well, I expect many of you to be familiar with what cultivated meat is. It has made quite big headlines this year and in the recent years, really. But for those that are not familiar, I will start with what is it, how is it made, and also very important, maybe most important, is why is cultivated meat important. Maybe just somewhat a repetition of a lot of what has been said today so far, but I guess we all speakers, we all can agree that many of the world's most urgent problems really share a common cause. Our food choices, and really more accurately, the production system that is catering for a lot of these choices, that is really animal agriculture. And so as we are really seeing that meat increases in demand, it is becoming essential to think the way that we produce meat if we want to avoid just catastrophic effects in the environment, in health, and in animals. And one way to do this really is by changing the process and not the food. And this is where cellular agriculture comes in, as cellular agriculture allows for the production of animal products without the need to breed, raise, and slaughter animals, and avoids many of the challenges that are posed by this industrialized animal agriculture. So first of all, answering that first question, what is cultivated meat? Well, cultivated meat is the result of changing the process in which meat is produced and not meat itself. The cultivated meat production process, as it happens, just in a very quick nutshell, you would have an animal from which a biopsy is taken and some cells are taken. Here it says stem cells, but then we could go deeper and talk about what kind of cells are taken from what animals. And then those cells are put into cultivation in a nutrient-rich environment in which this can be a bioreactor, in which many different kinds of steps can happen, such as expansion, propagation of the cells, or differentiation of the cells. And then the cells are harvested, are converted into a meat product in the same way, really, that animal muscle is converted into the cuts of meat that people are familiar to consuming, right? So one important reason really to make cultivated meat, and really at the heart, is taste, right? Cultivated meat has that potential to match real traditional meat coming from the animal industry. And it does match those preferences and habits without the need for behavioral change. People can continue eating the meat they know and they like without all of the negative effects. And this is very, very important. Another very important reason for cultivated meat to exist and to be developed is definitely animals. Cultivated meat has the potential to avoid the killing of billions of animals every year, and the suffering that is associated to this. It could really be a dramatic reduction of animals bred in captivity and used and slaughtered. Also, endangered species could also be protected. Meat from endangered species can be cultivated instead, and this could help decrease also wildlife poaching and hunting. And finally, of course, we can't forget the environment. Here we have some numbers that are linked to the study of Sinke, Swartz, and Sandturm from 2023, the ex-ante life cycle assessment of commercial scale cultivated meat production in 2030. And this study, for example, states that 92% less greenhouse gases could be linked to the upscale production of cultivated meat, as well as a reduction in 90% less land and 66% less water. These are really important numbers in how we can continue eating meat but not depleting the environment. Really then moving into how in this future in which cultivated meat enters the market, what does it look like, right? Well, first of all, one thing that we do at ProVeg really well is our understanding of consumer expectations, consumer attitudes. And this is something at the core of our activities. In this slide, for example, you see that we have gathered information from various studies, and we can be cautiously optimistic, really. There is a relatively high willingness to try cultivated meat across the world, despite the very low amount of information that is out there. And of course, the fact that it's not yet in the markets in most countries and in most regions in the world, except in the US and Singapore, but most consumers are at least curious to try it. More recently, us in ProVeg, we ran a study called the Smart Protein Project, which spanned across several countries, and it spanned across quite some years. And one very interesting result is that among the ranking of most trusted protein sources, cultivated proteins ranked second as trusted sources among the consumers that were surveyed. And this is pretty interesting, especially when we are comparing other alternative protein sources that are also already on the market, such as fungi or algae-based proteins. More immediately, you might think, well, despite this trust, when are we, and these expectations, when are we going to be seeing cultivated meat in the market, and what is this going to look like? Well, one very interesting immediate way that we think might be entering the market quicker is via hybrid products. So when I say hybrid products, I refer to products that will be partly made from plant-based ingredients and partly made from cultivated ingredients. For example, this can be meat replacers made of plant-based proteins mixed with cultivated fat, as some companies in Europe and also in the States propose. It's interestingly enough that, for example, we ran a study last year in the UK about the acceptance of hybrid products, and we found out that about 35% of UK consumers would try or buy hybrid food products, which is really already promising. Also, interestingly enough, we also found that about 1/3 of this population is still unsure. So it importantly points to the lack of information that is available to consumers. And there is a lot of room to inform the public about these novel products, these novel production processes, and help people make the best educated decisions and not just be overwhelmed when these products will be coming to market. As I reach the end of my time, really, I just wanted to explain a little bit about what we do here at ProVeg in relation to cultivated meat specifically, but also more generally in cellular agriculture. So at ProVeg, the Cellular Agriculture Project, we have a holistic view. We are not only focused on meat. We like to think about cellular agriculture as a group bundle of technologies that are going to allow us to change the process of many food categories, and really doubling down on this idea of animal products without the animals. And here we're talking about cell cultivation, so meat, seafood, and precision fermentation, dairy and eggs. More importantly, or more specifically, the Cellular Agriculture Project aims to accelerate cultivated alternatives by working with a broad range of cellular agriculture stakeholders. And in a nutshell, what it is that we don't really focus on the scientific side of things, but we rather focus on raising awareness and increasing acceptance of cellular agriculture in a cross-sectoral network and incentivizing collaboration within different people. So we work directly with consumers, aiming to understand the intentions of adoption, what are their barriers, their attitudes, as well as create materials and engage with them to provide them information so they may form more educated attitudes. We also work directly with corporates as we want to accelerate cell ag initiatives within big corporates, may this be investments, new research streams, or entrepreneurship. And we actively also support a farmer transition by taking part of ongoing conversations and projects with our expertise. More indirectly, in the Cell Ag project, we want to create all these pieces of evidence to stimulate public funding to ultimately also benefit Cell Ag. And with this a little bit over time, I would like to say thank you everyone for joining me today. You have here my contact, and I'll always be happy to just respond to any questions or talk to any of you. May you reach out.
Thank you very much, Julia. That was really interesting to hear, and especially how consumers might be ready to accept cellular protein and cellular agriculture as the meat in inverted commas that they're happy to eat. So to build on that, we are going to hear from our last speaker today, who is David Hunt from Good Food Institute Europe, and he'll be speaking about the organisation's work in alternate protein research and their training ecosystem. So thank you, David.
Thank you, Shireen. I hope you can see my slides and hear me.
Yep,
okay.
All good. Yeah.
I have the pleasure of going last, so I've been able to listen to these really insightful and interesting presentations, but now I have the challenge of trying to say something interesting and different than what everybody else has said. But as you say, what I'm going to do is dig into a little bit more around the scientific challenges in protein diversification and talk about this from the GFI perspective, and then also talk a little bit about what we do to support the ecosystem in this space. So just for those who are not familiar with GFI, we are an international nonprofit that seeks to create a sustainable, secure and just protein supply. And we work across 3 areas. So science and technologies, where I work, and that's around advancing foundational open access research in this space. Corporate engagement involves partnering with companies to drive investment and innovation in alternative proteins. And then policy is around advocating for fair policy around things like regulation, and also calling for public investment in research in alternative proteins. We are present in 6 different regions worldwide, and there's over 200 of us as it stands, although I think every time I present this slide, there's more people in the organization. Without really trying to repeat everything that's already been said in much more eloquent ways than I can do, what we, I think, increasingly understand is that industrial animal agriculture really sits at the intersection of many of the problems that we face as a global community. And that touches on things around environmental breakdown and sustainability, but also stuff like food security, public health, so the emergence of pathogens and antimicrobial resistance, and also concerns around animal welfare. Unfortunately, what we also know is that global meat production and demand just continues to rise. And it is predicted or forecast that by the year 2050, the demand for meat will increase somewhere between 50 and 100% based on the 2013 levels. And while we can educate consumers about the impacts that their diets have and the role that meat plays in that, and also the role that it plays in nutrition and health, it is very difficult to change consumer perceptions and consumer habits. What we also know is that consumer behavior really is driven by 3 foundational drivers, which are taste, price, and convenience. And of those, taste is absolutely king. And I think, as Anne has referred to, alternative proteins have a little bit of a challenge on their hands to meet that challenge. There are other things that influence consumer behavior, like health and impact and animal welfare, but they are much more aspirational ones. And when it comes down to it, people really make decisions based on taste, price, and convenience. And so based on that, GFI's theory of change is that really, instead of asking consumers to give up the foods that they love, we seek to accelerate the transition to a food system that is based on sustainable proteins that are delicious, affordable, and accessible to all. Or put more simply, really what we need is alternative proteins that can compete on taste, price, and convenience. So if we look at some challenges and opportunities in protein diversification, the first thing to say is that from a GFI perspective, really, we think about this as 3 production platforms or pillars, which are plant-based, fermentation-made, and cultivated meat. And I'll explain a little bit about the science and technology behind these in order now. The easiest way to understand, I suppose, where the challenges and opportunities lie is to see how these things are made. So for plant-based, really where it starts is in the field, and we source a particular crop or source of protein that can be used. We then process those raw materials and isolate the optimal ingredients from them, functionalize them such that they can be used then for product formulation and manufacturing, where science and art really come together to create foods that have a desired taste, texture, smell, and structure. But I think it's fair to say there's a lot of challenges across this entire value chain. And really, some of the key white space opportunities in plant-based are things like better raw materials. So I think, as María referred to, typically this relies on pea, wheat, and soy, and they're kind of suboptimal actually for this use. So finding other sources of protein, but also crop breeding to improve the protein quality and functionality. Protein fractionation needs to be done in a more energy efficient and with a lower degree of processing manner. improved fat profiles. So we know that fat is actually one of the things about meat that people really enjoy the most because it provides moisture and flavor. And we need to source and incorporate either fats or fat replacements into plant-based foods in order to meet that taste challenge. And then texturization. So actually getting plant proteins to behave like animal proteins is quite difficult to do because they're really quite fundamentally different in their biochemistry. So coming up with methods that are less energy intensive and that can create textures that actually are appealing to consumers is a major challenge also. If we look at fermentation as it I suppose is applied to alternative proteins, this falls into kind of three primary buckets. Traditional fermentation can be used to modulate, I suppose, the plant-derived ingredients such that their flavors or nutritional profiles, etc., can be improved. Biomass fermentation then seeks to use microorganisms as a source of protein in and of themselves. And then precision fermentation uses microbial hosts to produce specific functional ingredients that can either be used to improve the sensory characteristics of a food or their nutritional profile. There's a lot of, I suppose, challenges across this value chain for fermentation. And while this is a technology that's actually quite familiar to the food industry, and there, has been proven at scale, there's a lot of things from the kind of bioprocessing side of it all the way down to the product development side, and ensuring that we have foods that are both delicious, nutritious, and affordable for consumers. And then finally, cultivated meat. So I guess Julia is doing a very good job of explaining what cultivated meat really is. But again, to reiterate broadly, this is taking a sample of cells from an animal. We proliferate these cells or grow them in technology you might think of as being analogous to fermentation of things like beer or yogurt. Grow those cells up to a certain quantity or certain density, and then we stimulate maturation into specific types of cells, which are typically fats, muscle, or fibroblasts, which is connective tissue, which are the three types of cells that actually make up meat. And then by combining them, we're able to make a final product that is real meat, but is made in a more sustainable way. This is a very nascent area of research and industry. And there are a lot of challenges that we need to overcome to make cultivated meat scalable and make it affordable and economically viable for companies. And these touch on things like cell line development, so finding cells that grow quickly, that grow at high densities, and that are stable. The cell culture media, so that liquid that the cells actually grow in, that Julia spoke about, is one of the most expensive parts actually of cultivated meat at present. And bringing down the cost of those and ensuring we're using sustainable inputs for those is a very important part of optimizing this technology. Scaffolding is the use of plant or fungal proteins and carbohydrates to create a 3D structure into which cells can grow, and then that replicates the sort of whole cut experience of meat. And then bioprocess design goes all into bigger bioreactors, cheaper production methods for this, and ensuring that we can actually make it economically viable for companies to produce this into the long run. Now, having said that, I've talked about these as three sort of independent technology pillars, but really where we see this going is that alternative proteins will occur along a spectrum, and the companies who are really successful in this will pick and choose the right things to create products that are really appealing to customers, both in terms of their sensory experience and also ensuring that they are have a high nutritional value associated with them. And there is a challenge in that, as Anne has rightly highlighted. Alternative proteins have a way to go yet to really be appealing to customers in terms of taste. But we do see companies who are already starting to really lean into this. One example is the Impossible Burger, which is not actually on sale in Europe just yet, but this uses heme produced through precision fermentation, which is put into a plant-based burger in order to recreate some of the sensory experiences associated with cooking and eating meat. More advanced than that, again, would be the use of cultivated fat cells that's then incorporated into a texturized soy protein to create, say, cultivated chicken or beef or meat or whatever it might be. And that has a lot of the sensory experiences associated with eating conventional meat. So what does GFI do to support the research ecosystem? I guess the first thing to talk about is we create a whole lot of resources that are really quite useful for researchers, for industry, for policymakers. I could probably give a whole 10-minute presentation on the resources that we do have, but one really good place to start is our State of the Industry reports. We come out every spring. and look at basically all of the advances across these 3 pillars in the previous year, and that's things around business and investment, but also science and technology, policy, regulatory things. All of this stuff is free and open access, and you can also watch YouTube webinars where we actually present the kind of key findings from these, and all of those are available online if you go and have a look for them. You can join our GFI Ideas community. It just brings together people from business, from research, innovation in alternative protein to share ideas and to network. We also have 2 monthly webinar series, The Business of All Protein and The Science of All Protein, which explore different topics in alternative proteins once a month. I really recommend tuning in for them. They're super interesting. And again, you can watch previous episodes of those on YouTube going back a number of years now. We can help you find ideas and collaborators through our solutions database, which highlights some of the really key challenges in alternative protein research. We have a company database and an alternative proteins researcher directory to help you find people to work with on specific challenges. We also do a lot of things to help support things like, say, Horizon applications, etc., research funding applications. So please do reach out if we can help with that. We provide our own research funding through our Good Grants program that tackles very specific topics within alternative proteins. That is closed at the moment, but if it's something you're interested in, I think it opens again in late spring of 2024. And if you're a student, we have our Alt Protein project, which is a student-led network of 53 universities worldwide who work to get alternative protein research and education onto the strategies and programs of their respective institutions. So if you're a student and that's interesting to you, the applications for that open again in early 2024. So to conclude, and I hope I'm still on time, alternative proteins are key enablers for a more sustainable future food system. And while a lot of progress has been made, there are a huge amount of opportunities for researchers and innovators and entrepreneurs to make alt proteins tastier, cheaper, and more accessible. And if this is something you're interested in, GFI offers a range of different research tools, analyses, and support to innovators in the space, as well as research funding. So if we can help with anything, please do reach out to europe@gfi.org. You can sign up to our newsletter at gfi.org/newsletter. And thank you very much for your time.
Great, thank you very much, David. That was a really comprehensive overview of where we are in the different ways of producing alternate protein. You kept on time, which is fantastic, and an awful lot of resources there for people to follow up on. So thank you very much. So we are going to be now moving to gallery view and starting off with the Q&A. And I'm going to start with a question from the audience, and this is for Anne, I think, probably best with your cool food pledge hat on. Camilla asks, what do you think about enforcing inclusion of food emissions into corporate carbon footprints? Because you gave example of healthcare, but what about sort of corporations, and is this going to really support sustainability? Camilla fears that maybe animal welfare will be further detrimentally effective as we move away from ruminant animals to consuming birds or fish, which have a lower carbon footprint, but yet live still terrible lives. So what are your thoughts on that, Anne?
Yes, thank you. So two ways to answer the question. So first of all, I do think, yes, it would be very helpful if corporates were mandated to calculate their carbon footprint and report it and reduce it. There are voluntary schemes like the Cool Food Pledge, for example, or the Science Based Target Initiative, which actually help drive change. But the question is absolutely, there are a lot of trade-offs in sustainability, as we know, and which is why what we are really advocating for is a switch to plants, from animal food to plants, because that's the best way to navigate some of the trade-offs that the person has highlighted. So, and I think the more we shift to plant, actually that does create the climate space for better, more animal welfare options for some of the remaining species. So a really good question and a real challenge. But again, shift to plants, promoting that is really helping navigate this.
Yeah, thank you. And it's a similar experience in my hospital. We surveyed our patients and they're happy to get rid of red and processed meat from menus, but when you ask them what they're going to choose instead, they all say chicken. So there's a lot of education to be done there. My next question is going to be to Marco. On the one hand, we're sort of expecting the Lancet 2.0, so I don't know whether you've got any insights into that. But my question is, do you think that any of these alternate protein sources that we've heard about today, algae or cultivated meat, will find its way into the Lancet Commission report or the Planetary Health Plate 2.0?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah, I don't. We're already strapped with space in the report, so we might mention it here and there, and survey the literature slightly, but I don't think we'll integrate it into the formal recommendations. I mean, I think of note there, especially the ones that I mentioned. I mean, there are within the Commission for sure, there are strong concerns about any of those really ultra processed meat replacements. There are lots of emulsifiers, any other additives in there that in even very well conducted randomized control trials have shown that people that they encourage overeating. So from a health perspective, lots of those meat alternatives that look like meat that are very highly processed, they come in this basically junk food package and might have unintended health consequences, even though they're on a product level, they might be slightly better than red and processed meat, but they're still not good in terms of being actually healthy. So from that perspective, they will not feature as a recommendation. I think the picture is even more stark when you look at lab-grown meat. I think Julia mentioned this recent study. I mean, that recent study made strong assumptions about the energy supply and all of this. And there are also other estimates that actually put lab-grown meat on par with efficiently produced beef, So if you switched from, let's say, chicken to lab-grown chicken or lab-grown beef or lab-grown anything, you might increase your carbon footprint with that by a factor of 4 to 5. So, I think the sustainability claims for lab-grown meat are very contentious, and there is a huge range out there. So it might not be that is a very sustainable source. At the same time, if it's replicating red meat, then it will surely be associated with a similar detrimental health impact. We did some modeling looking at if they were able to, for example, tweak the fatty acid profile, but that didn't have much of an impact there. And as I know, as I heard, the actually introducing a proper fat content into lab-grown meat is actually not so easy. The first lab-grown burger basically didn't have any much fat in there. So and at the same time, huge investment is going into this sector. Whereas it's clear it's not performing well on nutritional health and probably also sustainability aspects, and it will always be more expensive than even normal beef. So in a situation where we have cost of living crises and consumers also in high income countries choosing less meat alternatives because of their high price points, I think this is really not the best road to put your eggs in, not the best basket. That's how you say, to put your eggs in. So yeah, sorry, I'm rather negative on any of those, but I think from a public health and sustainability perspective, there is no way around thinking more holistically about this than just, okay, we replace product for product, and then any of those products fall flat on a couple of those dimensions.
Yeah, thank you, Marco. You've sort of preempted another one of the audience questions that I might just pick up on there. But just to go back to the Lancet Commission, is there going to be any shift in the proportions of sort of animal-sourced protein in the coming revision, or are we expecting that to be the same? And also for me, you know, recommending 2 portions of fish for everybody for this growing global population, I haven't seen any suitable, sustainable solutions for that recommendation.
Yeah, they were always not intended as strict recommendations. So lots of people chose it as, oh, the mean recommendations, everybody needs to be at the mean. This time, we will be much clearer to say that those that there is a range, and you can be perfectly fine on a completely plant-based diet, for example. So, and we will have more illustrations of how sort of a planetary health diet can look like in different cultures for different socio-demographic groups and so on. So I think this will be sort of the innovation there. And
That's
also,
right.
yeah, that lots of those animal source foods are indeed, you know, they are optional. They are not needed per se. So yeah, keep your fingers crossed. It's still lots of work to do.
Okay, we'll look forward to that, and I shall be inviting you back to talk about it. So I might just continue the theme around the health aspect, because I guess we didn't really cover the predicted or the actual known health impacts of some of these foods. And as one of the audience members has asked, you know, are we not just sort of amplifying the current, certainly European problem of consuming far too much ultra-processed foods? And I'm not saying that this is necessarily my viewpoint, but there does seem to be in the medical literature a distinction between animal-based ultra-processed foods and their negative impacts, and the plant-based. And as you say, Marco, the plant-based meat alternatives are certainly better than eating red and processed meat, so it might be one step forward. But maybe we'll start with David. Did you want to comment on some of those things that Marco mentioned that is causing concern around health?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, and I think we do monitor this quite closely as well. We actually released a report just last week about nutrition and plant-based, and what you do see is it is a very broad spectrum, that there are a lot of different products on the market. One of the ways that I think we think about this sometimes is plant-based is a little bit like bread, where there's some bread that's very, very good for you, and there's some bread that's really not very good for you, and it all goes into how it's made and what the nutritional profile is of that particular food. And what we do see from that report is it is a very, very broad picture in terms of what's there and what goes into making these things. I mean, we do very much encourage manufacturers to think about the nutritional profile of the foods that they make, because, you know, as Marco rightly says, there's no point in solving one problem over here and causing a whole other problem on the other side of it. I think the ultra-processed thing is a little bit of a blunt instrument with which to classify food, because not everything that goes into the ultra-processed bucket is necessarily a bad thing for you. There are very, very highly nutritional foods that can be ultra-processed as well. And actually, you know, some of the things we've seen around the NOVA classification, for example, of ultra-processed food, is that people feel that is potentially worth a little bit of a review as well. I would just pick up maybe as well on some of the things Marco said about the sustainability of things like cell-based foods as well. And yes, like the you know, Julia presented results from that life cycle assessment that was looking at the year 2030. And actually the details of that study are around things like, if we can assume quite, you know, ambitious improvements in efficiency in animal-based agriculture by the year 2030, and we can look at where cell-based foods and cultivated meat can be, can we compare those two things? One of the assumptions that's made in that is that we will need to be basing our system largely around renewable energy. Now, I would argue that if by 2030 our energy systems have not shifted towards renewable energy, we are going to be in big trouble no matter what happens. And we always talk about renewable, or we talk about alternative proteins as being one of the 3 pillars of a transition towards a more sustainable system. And that's food, but that's also the way we power the production of food and everything else, and also transport. So these things need to move together, and they need to be, there's kind of I suppose, a multiplication effect where you see improvements in other sectors. They can also feed down into how we produce food, because it's such a long and complicated chain that goes into producing our food and to getting it onto supermarket shelves or onto restaurant plates or whatever it might be. The other thing to say is I think it's very important when we do these types of analyses that the data that goes into looking at how those life cycle assessments are done is really representative of where an industry currently is and where it plans to go. And sometimes the studies we see are a little bit of a blunt instrument that maybe are based off what the pharma industry would do, which are similar techniques, but are very, very different in terms of where they actually intend to go. Cultivated meat is a very nascent industry and is going to take a long time to really get this right and to be able to scale it up and to get it to a point where it is producing enough food to feed a lot of people. But to look at it now and say it's not good enough is, I think, a very short-sighted mistake. It would be like going back to the 1990s and looking at solar panels and saying they're not good enough, let's not continue to invest in this, or electric vehicles 15 years ago. And we can see how much improvement has been made in those technologies in that time. So I think it is worth keeping these things in perspective. Like cultivated meat is 10 years old. So we need to have a little bit of patience of where we can actually go with this.
Yeah, thanks, David. That was a really clear answer, and it certainly resonates with me around the sort of NOVA classification, and then virtually every plant-based product gets put into an ultra-processed category and used against people who are following a plant-based diet, as it's not going to be healthy. So thank you. I mean, Julia, do you have any further comments to make whilst we're on the sort of topic of cultivated protein alternatives?
Yeah, so thank you, Shireen. To be honest, I think David has worded my thoughts very clearly. I also just wanted to make a little remark to what Marco commented just before about the, I think, numbers, ciphers that he was citing about the potential way in which cultivated meat can be or is being compared to even being more environmentally damaging than traditional meat. And I think he was citing numbers that come from a non-peer-reviewed study. So that's something just to clarify. Yeah,
that's the Smetana paper, so that's peer-reviewed. And even Hannah Tomisto put out very high estimates of lab-grown meat that are also around 20 kilogram per CO2 equivalent per kilogram of product. And she put a lot on those, right? So,
well, so something to take up afterwards. You're probably leaving behind some of the audience here on your knowledge, but thank you. But Maria, I wanted to ask you a question around nutritional profile. You know, obviously your products are going to be even more sort of recent than the cultivated meat products, but how are you taking into account the nutritional aspects of the products you have or will be producing, and are you using particular regulatory frameworks there, and how will you ensure sort of health promoting properties?
Yeah, as I mentioned in the presentation, our product is basically a protein concentrate, so we are very concerned about the nutritious values, and as Michael is saying, like, it's important to have high quality, not only just quantity of material, but also high quality. So what we want to achieve is the requirements of the FAO for essential amino acids that have been published like for a few years at this point. And it's important for us, for example, to mix different species of seaweed in order to achieve all these nutritional values. In terms also of toxins, or of specifically for seaweed, the iodine or high amounts of zinc in some cases, this could go easily with processing. But yeah, as I mentioned, we're very early stage, still haven't tested properly. But that's the idea, to have a highly nutritious and functional product that then you can introduce in a matrix for plant-based products.
Great, thanks, Maria. And I will move back to you, Julia, because one of the audience members, sorry, I'm pronouncing this wrongly, probably, Remzier, asks about the safety of sort of alternate protein products and how consumers will be convinced. And I guess that feeds into another question that we were also going to cover around the debate on the legal framework, especially given the fact that, Italy has just banned cultivated meat. So, when there's such a sort of variety of sort of approaches legally to this so-called new food, how does that need to be approached and bring consumers along with you to ensure that they're going to be on board with the fact that these products can be a safe alternative?
So thanks for the question. I think there's two different things here. So first of all, it's on safety. And here we are relying on the relevant government bodies that are in charge of regulating this and that are fight for the best interest in consumers, right? So in this case, producers will follow what the best interest that is represented by organizations like the Food Standards Agency here in the UK. So that's one part. And in here, I am certain that the best standards will be put in place to protect consumers. So I don't think there is any concern in safety in terms of when cell-based products will be coming to market. And number two, I don't think there is any, getting on board or convincing consumers at all. This is just a matter of information, and that this will come in the hand with regulators. So it's a matter of making people understand with full transparency what is behind the production of the food they consume, and have them make their own choices, right? It's not an attempt to make anybody be on board with anything. It's a matter of transparency, education, and allowing people to make the best educated decisions of what they eat. In that same place, I feel that there's no getting on board people with anything. Yeah.
And so what do you think about the fact that sort of Italy has recently banned cultivated meat, and clearly it's a way of carrying on with the meat and dairy industry and pushing back against these new innovative ways of producing food. But how do we deal with those sort of challenges?
So on one side, I'm not a policy affairs expert, so my contribution here is very limited. But of course, as with many other things and many other freedoms in different countries, these are used as political instruments. We have seen countries ban abortion, for example, and this corresponds to political gameplays that are beyond my expertise, right? So there's also big conflicts of interest and big industrial societies that push the political agenda in their preference, as we have seen in the past. So again, I don't think I'm qualified or an expert to be able to comment on these, but I personally believe that the cultivated meat has sadly fallen into the side of this political gameplay. And then, following the word and the question that was there from the public, the best way to, defend ourselves against this kind of situations is with information, with education, and with a clear understanding of what are really the risks or the advantages of different technologies. So this is where it's our only resource, really.
David, do you have any comment to make around the legal framework around the newer products?
Yeah, I mean, look, I guess what I'd say is two things. The first is on the Italy thing. We see it as being quite unfortunate that they've taken this step. We see it as a barrier to innovation in Italy. There's a lot of scientists that we work in Italy on cultivated meat who are quite frustrated with where this has gone. But we, think it is just an unfortunate thing that has happened, and we're not even sure if it's necessarily, I suppose, that meaningful, given that cultivated meat is not actually available for sale at the moment. Which brings me on to the regulatory thing, which is, as Julia has talked about, the regulatory standards in Europe are the highest in the world. They are very much in favor, and this is, I'm talking about EFSA and also the Food Standards Agency in the UK, which are very, very similar in terms of the way that they evaluate these foods. They are very much on the side of the consumer, ensuring that there is safety in how these foods are assessed, and they're very, very detailed in the information that companies are required to give before they are given permission to actually sell their foods on the European market. So I think we are very, very happy with that situation, because we think, you know, these things need to be robustly looked at and scrutinized, so that consumers can have confidence in these foods. And we wouldn't call for that to change in any way. One thing I will say that we've seen has been quite positive, which has happened in the Netherlands, and I think the UK are also making a move towards this as well, is authorizing, I guess, pre-approval tastings of things like cultivated meat and cells-based foods, which allows just, you know, general consumers to come in and try these foods and see what they are and interact with them and ask questions and understand where does it come from and how is it made and why is it potentially a better alternative to conventionally made meat. And that is a thing that really helps to gain people's confidence in this thing. If they can see it and interact with it and understand what it is and taste it, that is really, really powerful in terms of actually getting people to feel more comfortable with innovations in food. And we understand that food is very, very personal to people on their own personal level, but also on a cultural level as well. And so we have to respect that, and we have to ensure that as we move forward, all of those things are balanced against each other, that the innovation is happening at a pace also that people are comfortable with.
Yeah, thank you. That's really interesting. Those are really interesting insights and important points raised. So I'm just going to change gear a little bit, Anne, coming back to you and really sort of focusing in on sort of behavior change. You know, you talked about behavior change science and getting consumers to make different choices without it appearing that they are actively moving away from something that they want to consume. So in your kind of role, what have you seen as the most sort of effective ways of shifting consumer behavior and getting their buy-in in terms of changing the meals they eat?
Sorry, this is to me.
Oh,
So, Anne.
Yes, thank you. I mean, the good news is that there are a lot of strategies, and that's really what we're trying to summarize in our 6P framework. So I can put a link in the chat if people are interested, but, you know, just to give you a couple of examples. So at the Bordier, we've done a lot of research on language, for example. So, you know, we know that if you, I don't know, for example, call a dish a vegetarian risotto or a delicious, you know, mushroom of the forest risotto, there's much more chance of people choosing the second option than the first. So language is a really good strategy. And actually a lot of food service companies have been doing a lot of work in that space. And, you know, we know it's working and it's been widely adopted and it's relatively easy to do. We're quite excited by hybrid and blended products. There's some really interesting things happening in the US, particularly on blended burgers. There's a lot of really great innovation. And, you know, sometimes people actually prefer the taste of a blended burger versus, you know, a purely meat burger. And that can have a really interesting impact in terms of greenhouse gas emission reduction. So we think that's a really interesting strategy. But, you know, there's some really good things going you can do on messaging, on placement. So in our new playbook, we've identified, you know, nearly 20, you know, no regret techniques, if you like, that food service providers can adopt, which are scientifically proven in the literature to work. And when we tested them with industry, you know, they also told us they are operationally very viable as well. So certainly a lot that can be done now to make it easier for all of us to make better choices.
Great, thank you. And just to stay with you, Anne, I don't know whether you have any thoughts around, you know, how this transition away from animal source protein will impact farmers. For us in the UK, we had a great national food strategy with recommendations that, of course, our government have not taken on as policy. But within that, it was suggested that there actually may be many more roles for farmers. farmers in terms of, or at least in factory jobs, but also farming jobs to produce protein crops. For example, for us in the UK, we import a lot of our plant sources of protein, but it could be growing them. But how do you cover that issue around sort of farmers and transitioning?
So look, I mean, we haven't done any specific research on this, so I don't have any, actual research to share. I do think, though, this transition is challenging for the farming community, and we need to think about that as a community. I don't think we should underestimate this challenge and the difficulty the farming community is facing in this transition. So I think it's a really important question, but I don't feel very well equipped to talk to it.
Yeah.
What I would say, though, is in terms of alternative proteins, I mean, for sure, this could be, a new industry of the future, and that by definition will create economic opportunities. And actually, we are seeing some governments, starting to wake up to this and really starting to, create the conditions to get behind this, because they do recognize it will create jobs. And I think earlier this year, there was a really interesting report actually published by Climate Works Foundation and the Global Methane Hub. And it did show that, from a methane, food system methane mitigation point of view, actually alternative protein was a really interesting sector, which could create millions of jobs. So definitely, an economic opportunity, but I think we need to think about how we support the farming community in this position for sure.
Yeah, and Marco, in your work, because it's sort of been cross-sectional really in terms of industries, have you got a view on terms of farmers and employment and economic opportunities?
At the moment, we're working actually on a paper on looking at labor demand for different dietary patterns. And we do find in there that there is a strong need to proactively manage this. I mean, according to our results, it seems that more plant-based dietary patterns would require somewhat less labor, but not very often, especially in high-income countries, not less labor necessary in agriculture in general. So there is also quite a need, for example, for nature conservation work and nature work in nature-based solutions that is not so dissimilar to agricultural work at the moment. So, but having basically proactive policies that would manage transitions and create opportunities for that would be very important. I mean, I guess one of the problems is at the moment to actually find laborers for agriculture, because it's not a job that very many people want to do. So I think, as with anything, if our governments sleep on this, we run into problems, but there are opportunities to manage this sustainably, I think, especially with an eye to other structural change transitions that have occurred in the past, like, for example, the move from coal producing areas, for example, in the Ruhr Valley or so in Germany, to sort of a more mixed economy. I think some similar lessons could be applied when it comes to agricultural labor.
Great, thank you very much. Now, Maria, I'll ask you this question, but also probably Julia and David. One of the attendees has asked, do we really think that these cultivated or products or newer ways of producing protein can be scaled fast enough to actually make a difference in the ecological crises? And sort of on a related note, for me, I also worry about the scale-up process when it comes to certainly cellular agriculture, and having done it on a very small scale in my PhD and growing cells, I mean, it's not easy, and it does require antibiotics and inputs. And as you say, the serum that's currently used, there's animal inputs for certainly for some technologies there. But I'll start with you, Maria. What do you think about the ability to scale up in order to actually make a tangible difference?
Yeah, it's important. One of the main questions always from investors, from companies, is like, are you able to scale up your product? So it is important from a point of view of the industry. And I think in the case of the seaweed, for example, for us, as I mentioned in the presentation, is actually easy enough because we are actually reusing products. So there is tons and tons of material that is available there, and we just need to process that material in a way that we obtain a high yield of extraction and we obtain the product. Obviously, with other materials such as microalgae, for example, or cultivated meat, this is a thing that needs to be investigated. But they were saying as well, like same as with electric cars, for example, nobody was giving any acknowledge to this like a few years ago, and now they are all everywhere, right? So I think that science needs time, which is very important for people to understand that science technology needs time and needs years of it to moderate, let's say, the ideas and to actually come into industry. So yeah, that's
yeah, thank you. So Julia, do you have a view on that? And also Camilla's question about, you know, whether you'll ever be able to have a price parity with supposed conventionally produced meat?
Yeah, thank you for passing the word to me. I also think it follows some of Marcus's statements about cultivated meat is always going to be very expensive. It's never going to have price parity. First of all, I think it's very difficult to glass wool. That's an absolute reality. I echo David's words in terms of like there is a timeline. It's not immediate. Otherwise, cultivated meat would be in the shelves everywhere today because it's just a better solution. But there is a timeline for that. Number two, cellular agriculture products are not only cultivated meat. We have precision fermentation products that are already on the shelves. They're already in the shelves in the States, in Singapore. I've consumed those products, and they're increasingly building capacity. So that's already a reality. And then going back to cultivated meat, again, it is a matter of glass bowling, but not only about electric cars. If you'd have told people in the 80s or in the 70s that they were going to be holding a computer in their hand as smartphones are today, and the way that has profoundly and radically changed the way that we work, that we relate to each other, that we see the world, it would have been unthinkable, right? And even if you have asked me 15 years ago when I had my first phone in my hand, that 15 years later would have changed the world, I wouldn't have believed that. So that could be the timeline that we're looking at in cultivated meat, because science definitely needs time, and breakthroughs are needed to be overcome. But then changes can also happen very, very fast and very, very profound. So yeah, there is that educated and informed just positive attitude that needs to be there, especially given what is at stake. And then reaching price parity, I think it applies just in the same way that we have seen the evolution of microchips change and the evolution of that price point, and how, for example, just computers are very widely affordable in comparison to what they were even 10 or 15 years ago. So that, again, lowering that cost and that achieving that price parity with what regular animal products looks like today is something that could be very, very achievable.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and it's a very good points made there for sure. I'm not quite sure who's best to answer Jerry's questions, but maybe David, are you able to read those? It's suggesting other sources of protein and also acorns with 25% fat content and oak varieties. Are they an option for your type of product?
Given how slowly oak trees grow, I suspect maybe not. And I think let's leave trees alone and let them do what they're good at, which is taking carbon dioxide out of the air. There are a lot of solutions for producing fat from, as Julia says, things like precision fermentation or sourcing them from other types of crops. Whether acorns, we're talking about scalability, whether acorns would be scalable, I don't know, but very open to being corrected on that.
And tree leaf, the protein from tree leaf, able to?
Probably parallel to increasing compatibility. That's an interesting one. And like, okay, this, I think maybe it comes onto a different thing, which is more about sort of side streams and agricultural side streams and using those and upscaling those and bringing that circularity into the economy. And whether it's things like things from trees or whatever it might be. I mean, Maria's talked about using side streams from harvesting of seaweed. You know, one of the things that's very interesting to us, and we released a report on this a little while ago, looking at agricultural side streams in the United States and how can we use those for things like sourcing, you know, the feedstocks for fermentation or sourcing amino acids for things like cell-based meat, etc. We need to also understand what are we doing now and how can we really increase the efficiency of the agricultural processes that we have. And we will also, you talked about farmers, we will always need to depend on farmers to produce crops, to produce things like the amino acids and feedstocks that go into cell-based production. And that offers them the possibility to do their agriculture in a different way and maybe a more sustainable, less intensive type of way. So I think looking at the opportunities for circularity in the economy and finding ways to, I suppose, eliminate waste and use those things and upscale them for human food rather than what we do now, which is grow lots and lots and lots of crops and then feed them to animals and then eat the animals, which is not the most efficient way to make our food. How do we tap into that and how do we use that to reduce water use and land use and greenhouse gas emissions and all these types of things? And we know that the potential is there, but we need to get there. And back to your other question about scalability, can we do it? Yes, we can if we invest. And we have to do that. We have to really ramp up investment now and get serious about it.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Thank you. And Maria, with your potential newer products, have you had some consumer feedback and testing? You know, what has the response been when you've done that?
Yeah, we actually are running in the next year consumer perspective on seaweed products. But what we know so far is that some part of the European population consider this as a dirty taste because it just comes from the sea and it has this marine taste. So people that are used to eat seaweed products, for example, from the coast will be very happy to have them in their diets. But people that are mainly from mainlands or any other parts of Europe are more hesitant to actually go through them. That's why, as Julia was saying as well, education is very important, and we need to actually spread out the word and educate the consumers what they are eating, to understand that there are actually many products in the market that are not healthy at all, and that those could easily be very bad for their health, and that natural products, even if they are ultra processed, they can be healthy. So it's important. The education is key.
Great, thank you. So we're coming to almost a close in the next few minutes, but Julia, I just wanted to ask you to comment on your smart protein report and what the insights and forecasts from that report have been.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, the ProVeg has recently made some big waves in the media due to the Smart Protein report. That, of course, we're only part of the communication and dissemination package, which involves a series of universities and other stakeholders. So it's not all of our credit to take. I absolutely recommend everyone watching us today that they take a look at the Smart Protein report. It is widely been announced in social media, and it's also embedded in our webpage at ProVeg International. And it has basically to the moment been releasing a lot of EU-based consumer data. So most of from our side in ProVeg International, most of the credit goes to my colleague Elsa. And she found that about half of Europeans are actively looking to actually decrease their meat consumption, and that drivers are health mainly, but also animal welfare and environment. And about 1/3 of Europeans actually consider themselves flexitarian, with Germany, Netherlands, and Austria being the most, let's say, populated with this self-denominated flexitarians. I was particularly excited about the slide that I presented about how cultivated meat and cell-based products in general are regarded as second to be trusted in front of products that are already in the market, which sets just a very, very positive expectations and a very good positive perception from the public. So yeah, it's very rewarding.
Great, thank you, Julia. Okay, so to finish the Q&A section, there's going to just be a quick last question, lightning round to all the panelists. So just answer in 1 or 2 short sentences. What is your greatest hope in the area of plant-based and alternate protein sources, and what can be done to support this? So we'll start with you, Anne.
My biggest hope is, there are a lot of conversations about this whole area. Maybe it's because of my job. And there's a lot of interest, but this really needs to materialize into action now. And critically, it needs to materialize into stepped up investment by the private sector, but also by governments. And we haven't talked much about that yet. I think David just, mentioned investment. There's a really big gap in terms of where we are and where we need to get to. And my hope is, we haven't talked about the COP conference, which has started this week. And we know there's a big push to for governments to invest more into food system at this COP. So I hope that's going to, catalyze more action, but critically more dollar investment as well.
Great, thank you. A lot of nodding in our Zoom room here from what you've said. Thank you. Maria.
Yeah, what it's been said, I think the most important point is educate the consumer, and not only the consumer, but also the food industry, but sometimes it needs to be educated as well. And also to invest in science and technology and in food industry, food education, just for the young people to understand what is good, what is bad, or that there is no real good and bad, but that, there is a mix, and to be aware of that. Investment from public and private, both are necessary.
Great, thank you. Marco.
Yeah, I would wish for a bit more holistic perspective on all of this. I mean, I understand that some people have products to sell and want to, make their product appeal very nicely. But I mean, in the end, we have confluenting crises and challenges that include not only the environment, but also health and costs. And I think looking at all of those holistically would make lots of sense, and not only looking at the product level, but also seeing how all of this integrates in a healthy and sustainable diet.
Thank you. David.
Yeah, I think for me, it's not necessarily about having hope as such. It's about, we need to figure out where we want to go to have a really genuinely sustainable and fair and secure and nutritious food system. And it's about mapping out what that looks like and generating the knowledge and the information that we need in order to get there. And then, yeah, public funding to actually make it happen.
Great, thank you. And Julia?
I can just second what Maria and Anna have said about investment and education. This is really the two main focuses, particularly for one reason or for some reason, education, especially consumer education, tends to sometimes fall into the cracks, because who is supposed to be involved in this? But it's absolutely essential. Habits can be changed, the way that people behave can be changed, and it can be done by individuals that receive enough information and a very whole perspective of what they can do and what is available out there. And finally, to me, what is most important is to be based on facts, to be based on information, and not just be grappling into something or against a certain technology or against a certain option to try to find solutions, right? So it's really there is a space to build a better future through many approaches, and we need to keep mindful of that.
Great, thank you very much. So just leaves me to do a short roundup, and of course, thank you all for being part of this really interesting, informative and a discussion panel, which I think has left us with a lot to think about and some new ideas to take forward. So what we've heard this afternoon is that clearly the current food system is broken. It's neither supporting human health or planetary health, but we do have solutions available for which we can utilize to keep the food system within planetary boundaries, but we do need dietary guidelines and governments and policymakers to really get on board with this, alongside having real incentivize consumers to change behaviours. And as Anne pointed out, there's sort of three main levers of shifting to a plant-rich diet, improving agricultural practices, and then, of course, scaling alternate proteins, of which we have been hearing a lot about, but really implementing behavioural science understanding into public sector and the food environment can really help shift public perspectives and their shopping and purchasing behaviours. And then Maria told us about the fascinating new technology that is as part of her new company, where algal protein is being concentrated and can be used within new products. And I guess we will watch this space to learn more. Whereas Julia and David talked about cultivated meat, which is a bit older, a decade old, and really consumers are beginning to accept this as a viable alternative to meat, but we need to work on taste, nutrition, convenience, accessibility, and be able to scale this at a level that's and at a degree that's fast enough to mitigate against our current nature and climate crisis. But you leave us with hope, and clearly you're all working really hard in this space and genuinely making a difference. So thank you very much. So some closing remarks about the next steps for PlantEurope. This recording will shortly be uploaded onto the YouTube channel, so please do look out for that and share it with your colleagues and any interested individuals that you know who'll benefit from this discussion and knowledge sharing. And just to be aware that PlantEurope team will be publishing a paper on best practices in Europe to make a plant-based diet included in public policy, and that will be coming out very soon. So make sure you become a member or subscribe to our newsletter if you want to be first to read this new report. And then secondly, the team will be highlighting good practice approaches to promote a plant-based diet in Europe. So that report will be the second report coming out soon. And please remember, if you haven't already, to join the network and benefit from the numerous small networking events for free. There's going to be a small member event coming up focusing on vegan labelling. So you need to be able to register for that as a member. It's free of charge, but do take a look at the members area and join that discussion. There's an online community as well that you can network with, and you register today for the newsletter to stay up to date with all the events and reports that will be coming up. So thank you for being a really engaged audience. A massive thank you again to our panelists and speakers, and of course the PlantEurope team for helping to make this afternoon run very smoothly. So thank you very much, and we will say goodbye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you for the good insights.